his talk was interesting in and of itself. My biggest problem with Nigel Farage is you see the video that he did with Avi Yemini, where Avi's challenging him on Islam, and Nigel Farage doesn't really have an answer to Islam. It's the same mainstream answers of, oh, not, you know, the vast majority of Muslims are good. And, you know, Avi Yemini asked him, well, Avi Yemini makes the point, that, well, you know, Muhammad is considered the ideal man, and, you know, all Muslims are supposed to behave like Muhammad. And Muhammad married a 6-year-old, consummated the marriage at 9, and killed hundreds of people. So this is the ideal man according to the Quran and the Hadiths, and this is the Islamic faith. And Nigel Farage, he didn't know how to answer that. He basically said, well, you know, you're judging the Quran by the Quran, you know, we can reinterpret it. It would be like judging the Old Testament or the Bible by the Old Testament. And it's like, he obviously hasn't done any study on the Old Testament. He obviously hasn't seen Jordan Peterson's videos on the Old Testament, because if he knew anything about the Bible, he wouldn't say that. The Old Testament is a lesson. It's a lesson in how to behave and what happens if you misbehave. The whole point of it is, if you don't follow God's laws, God will destroy you. That's the whole point of the Old Testament. And the New Testament is about Jesus Christ and the ideal man. So they work together. It's like, this is before, you know, this is where we learn our lessons, and this is where we learned our lessons and applied those lessons. So Nigel Farage obviously doesn't understand the difference between the Quran and the Bible, which is fine. He's not really, it's the one area where he isn't up to speed. It's the one area where he really could work on it, and he really should reassess his views. I think it sort of lends to more the fact that he's sort of more of that upper middle class. He is sort of a member of the establishment. I mean, he traded commodities for all that time, so he's probably not completely red pill on everything at the moment, but he does speak very, very well.
Okay, this is going to be really interesting, because I think you make some really good points about how, like, when you understand how the Old Testament, I see the Old Testament as a story of the development of human understanding of God, and then everything that the Old Testament is working towards is fulfilled in the New Testament. But I actually had a different take on Avi's interview with Nigel Farage, because I did see that. The impression I got from the interview was that Nigel Farage sees the problem as bigger than Islam. If you think of the idea that, like, communism, cultural Marxism, globalism is the AIDS, and Islam is the cold that kills us when the AIDS destroys our immune system. So that was the impression that I got of why Nigel Farage gave that answer. I think Nigel Farage is, well, I don't agree with his distinction between Islam and Islamism. I think Avi made a good point in that regard. But it's kind of where I'm going as well. Like, it's, for me, Islam was kind of like the pathway to understanding just how serious the issue of the way that the idea of multiculturalism and mass immigration, whether we're talking about dysgenic populations, whether we're talking about dysgenic political ideology of Islam, or whether we're talking about high IQ, hardworking people from Northeast Asia, just the way that completely upsets the demographic balance. To me, that's actually a bigger issue. Like, if we can get our borders under control, if we can stand up for our own culture, if we can defeat the globalists, if we can defeat the cultural Marxists, we can defeat Islam. We can just cut it off.
And in that regards, I agree.
Yeah.
See, don't get me wrong. I still thoroughly respect Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
My issue was really the way he answered Avi in those particular questions about, you know, and comparing Islam to Christianity, and it just showed me that Nigel Farage, there's sort of a gap in his knowledge there, and there's a gap in his charisma. But someone mentioned in the chat, and you mentioned it as well, going to war with Islam and treating Islam as the #1 enemy, it's not the way to go. It's not the way to win. Because the real enemy are globalists and the left.
It's the enemy at home. It's the enemy that we have at home.
And the real enemy are the leftists and the globalists who let him in, and the leftists who defend them whenever they misbehave, and the leftists who call you a racist for calling it out, and the leftists who want to police your speech in pretty much every area imaginable, and the leftists who want to censor conservatives from the internet. In that regards, he's completely right. They are the true enemies. They are the enemies, and the globalist establishment, that is the enemy. And if you defeat the globalist establishment, then you can defeat the other dangers.
So it's not saying
later
that
on
Islam
down the
isn't
track.
an enemy.
Yeah,
it's not saying that Islam isn't an enemy. Yeah, that's right. Am I doing the shaky camera thing?
Yeah, you're making the camera shake.
Yeah, right.
It's like
a Steven Seagal movie.
Yeah. We haven't had enough bones broken for it to be a Steven Seagal movie.
I keep remembering to look at the camera.
Yeah. The camera is the people. Yeah. Stop checking yourself out, mate. It's just wrong. It's just weird.
Yeah. So it was really interesting to see that conversation, because you could see it as like an argument over tactics as much as anything else. Like, okay, who's the bigger enemy? Who do we go after? Yeah.
And someone just mentioned in the chat as well, Lee Roberts said that Nigel Farage doesn't want to be labelled a racist, and that's probably a fair cop. He doesn't want to have those attacks and all those labels. But it's just strange, because Farage is the kind of guy who says what he thinks and comes out and invites attack. You got to hear one of these stories, one of the stories that he tells about when he first got into the European Parliament, and the European Parliament brought up this new president, and you got to see the story. I just showed you. It's on this bloke's channel, Johnny Moore's channel, and you can see the whole thing. You actually really enjoy this talk. See, he talks about borders, and he talks about Europe, and he wants individual European nations to return and all that kind of stuff, and it's fine. But what I thought was really good was the anecdotes and him talking about the things he'd said in Parliament. He's a very witty individual. He's very charismatic. He's very quick as well.
Do you reckon he passes the pub test?
He passes the pub test, and that's the thing. He's a classic English drunkard with an IQ over 130, maybe potentially over 140. I don't know if it'd be that high, but he's a formidable individual. You wouldn't want to go toe to toe with verbal sparring him, because he'd rip you a new one in most cases.
Well, it made for a really interesting video, that chat between Avi and him.